ado, I hand over to Malcolm. Malcolm, go.
Yeah. Just lighting.
Sorry, I can see that.
El Mole Rachamim Shoichei El Mole Dayan Amonois Avi Yesoimi Alno Secheshe Esisapat Letam Yisroel Shenishpak Amoyim Ametzeh Menucha Nechoino Kanfei Ashkina Aloi Oy Shimoti Oyevim Kizoyar Rakia Kirim Umasirim Benismayim Jelbivoy Salafei Yisroel Anoshim v'noshim V'lodim v'lodais Eregu v'nishchatu v'nishrufu Echneku v'nikru v'ayim Warotos asher noga bohen yad hatzorer ha-germoni u'geruro G'day, g'day, shimutayirim, u'bohem g'yoyenim v'tzadikim, arzei alevovenay, adirei atoira, v'ganei osam, lochein avalorachamim, Yastivim, the say, Kinofov Liolamiyim, for Victorafayim, Espishposom, Adonai, Unachalosom, Yanoach Vishalom, Al Mishkavam, Benaimar, Amen. Yahainu, Obeis Yisrael, Acheinu, Obeis Yisrael, Anesunim Atzara, Atzara Vashivya, Oy midin vein bayam, vein bayam. Vayamahakam Yerachem, Yerachem, Yem yoytiem mitzara, Oy mitzara, Yom Afela Yavira. Omishiba ligiula yashta, oy vagola, uvizman kari.
Malcolm, thank you very much. I am delighted to formally welcome and introduce Mrs Mala Tribich MBE. Mala was born Mala Helfgott in 1930 in Piotrków Trzebianski in Poland. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, Mala's family fled eastwards. When they returned, Mala's family were interned in the ghetto established in her hometown, the first to be established in Nazi-occupied Poland. For a time, Mala and her cousin were taken by a couple named Maciejewski, who had received prior payment from her family to do so, to Częstochowa to try and pass as Christian children and stay there until the deportations were over. Mala was eventually taken back to Piotrków. Shortly after Mala's return to the ghetto, there were further roundups during which her mother and 8-year-old sister were taken. All these people who were taken in the roundup were murdered in the local forest. Soon afterwards, Mala had to undertake responsibility of caring for her 5-year-old cousin, Anne Helfgott, whose mother was deported. When the ghetto was subsequently liquidated, Mala became a slave laborer until November 1944, when the remaining Jews were deported. Mala was separated from her father and brother and was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. After about 10 weeks, they were transported in cattle trucks to Bergen-Belsen, where she remained until its liberation by the British Army 75 years ago. At the time of Mala's liberation, she was very ill with typhus, and it took many weeks for her to recover. 3 months after liberation, Mala was sent with a large group of children to Sweden, where she spent nearly 2 years. Mala did not expect any members of her family to survive. She was therefore surprised to receive a letter from her brother Ben, better known to us as Sir Ben Helfgott, who was the only member of her close family to survive. In March 1947, Mala was reunited with Ben in England, learnt English, attended secretarial college, and within a year was working in an office. In 1949, she met Mrs Tribich, whom she married in 1950. Whilst the children were growing up, Mala studied and gained a degree in sociology from the University of London. Today, Mala is widowed and has 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Whilst we light a flame to remember the Holocaust once or twice a year, Mala keeps the light of remembrance burning by speaking to all strata of British society, from prime ministers, cabinet ministers, school children, and many schools, amongst others. We are once again delighted to welcome Mala to our virtual shul to recount her experiences to us. Mala.
Thank you. Well, you've really got my whole story in a nutshell, but I'll go into some more details. So you know that I was born in Piotrków Trybunalski. And I'll just like to tell you a little bit about the town, because our town had a Jewish press, which meant that a lot of Siddurim were printed in our town, and they still exist today, some of them here. I met someone in your synagogue who told me they had, I can't remember who it was, but he told me that he has a Siddur printed in Piotrków Trybunalski. So we had a total population of about 55,000, of which 15,000 were Jewish. And Poland, well, Piotrków has the distinction of being the first ghetto created in Poland after the war started. So within 2 months of the beginning of the war, by the 1st of November, we had already been forced out of our homes and into ghetto walls. They weren't physical walls around the ghetto, but it was very heavily guarded, and ultimately it did have barbed wire as well. Now, ghetto life is something that is really a subject of its own. It is there were so many ghettos, and every single one was different. We're all subject to the same rules, but they were run differently, and the Germans were very clever. They actually, each ghetto had a Jewish administration in it, which meant that sometimes the Jews had to do their dirty work for them, because they could turn up and say, we want 200 men by tomorrow morning, and you've got to produce them, get them, or of a certain age, probably for a labor camp or something. But the point is that the Jewish policemen had to do the rounding up. They had to arrest sometimes their own relatives. And this is, again, the Jewish police and Jewish administration. That's a very big subject of subject of its own, because it's got a lot of moral issues that people could argue either way. And actually, it often comes up for discussion on March of the Living, when they really, some of the young people have a very, very intensive course of learning, traveling through Poland. And this is one of the things that comes up, among other things. And people can look at it all different ways. But, well, that wasn't the only thing. We were very restricted. We're not allowed out of the ghetto at any time. We also had curfews inside the ghetto. And there was one particular German officer called William who was in charge of the ghetto. And he used to turn up quite unexpectedly often with a very, very big black dog, a very ferocious dog. And he used to let it loose on people. And that dog was actually trained to attack people, particularly men, in a certain way that I can't even bear to repeat. People over the age of 12 had to wear a white band on the forearm with a blue Magen David on it. We were subjected to the most terrible things, all sorts of humiliations. I'll give you one example. Well, this wasn't a humiliation. It was unfortunately very tragic, but there's a man in our block of flats where we lived during the war. And he was shot in the hall, and he was left lying there for a week. So every time we wanted to go in or out of the building, we had to pass this dead body. He was actually someone we knew because he was, he was a neighbor, but he was also he was an accountant, and he was my father's accountant. And at that time, I had never even seen a dead body, and that was very traumatic for me. But there was a lot of trauma during that period. They had no use for people, for young children or old people. So only the sort of middle part of the population had any chance of survival. And the men usually had work permits. I mean, a work permit was like a permit for life. Not necessarily, but it was certainly a better situation to be in than being without a work permit. Because people were constantly being rounded up and deported. And I won't go on about the ghetto too much. But after about 2.5 years, rumors started circulating that the ghetto was going to be liquidated and everybody was going to be deported. That was except for people with work permits. So there was quite a panic, and people tried to make arrangements somehow to save themselves or their children. And there were various ways and means of smuggling myself out and living in the open, but it was all very difficult. But there are also people who are actually willing to save a Jewish person, a child or an adult, for money. And some people made it into quite a lucrative business. And my parents, together with my aunt and uncle, the Klein family, were recommended to a man who lived in Częstochowa, a town about an hour away from Piotrków. And this man was not only Christian, Polish, but he was actually of German origin. So he enjoyed a lot of more privileges than the average Pole. and we were going to be even safer with him. And for that reason, it was also more expensive. And arrangements were made for us to travel to Częstochowa one at a time. He was smuggled into the ghetto. He was paid in advance. And well, within a couple of weeks, we found ourselves in Częstochowa. My cousin Ija Klein was an only child. I was one of three, the middle one of three, with an older brother, Ben, and a younger sister, Lucia. And Ija was, well, we were both very homesick. The family they were not exactly thrilled to have us, but they didn't even treat us. We were okay. But we're very vulnerable, and we were very homesick, and we're very unhappy. So Ija, who was an only child, really couldn't bear it, and she asked to be taken back. She was told that the deportations are still going on, she can't go back. And she said that her parents have very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding their valuables, and they'll take her in. So they said okay, and they went off back to Piotrków, and I was still languishing there for what seemed like a lifetime. Eventually the time, and I went through all sorts of things which I don't have time to tell you about, but eventually the time came for me to go back. It was arranged that we would meet at the flour mill where my father was working, which before the war belonged to him in partnership with his brother and another man. But now he was lucky to get a job there. And when we got there, we had to walk up to the top floor, and there was my father waiting for me. It was a sort of big storeroom. But there was also my uncle, Joseph Klein, Ija's father. And he looked at us and he went white with shock. He said, where's my daughter? And this man said, I took her back to Piotrków, to your friends. He mentioned the name. Actually, you mentioned the name in this write-up of me you gave, Maciejewski. I've stopped mentioning it, but it's obviously on the computer still, because I don't think it's really all that safe to mention names. But anyway, I used to mention it, so it's still around. And he said he's taken my cousin. So my uncle said, well, where is my daughter? And he said he's taken her back to these friends. And my uncle said, but she's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child? And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, pacing there and back, saying, what have you done with my child? And this is the end of the story, because nobody knows what happened to Ija. After the war, well, my aunt actually, she lost her husband, because my uncle was soon after that arrested with a lot of other people, and they were kept in jail for a little while. Then they were taken to the Jewish cemetery, and they were all lined up against the wall and shot. So my aunt lost her husband and her daughter with a very short time. She survived the war, and her first priority was to go back to Piotrków and to Częstochowa to see what happened to Ija. But those German people were gone. They were nowhere to be found, and she found out. We didn't often talk about Ija after the war because it was too painful, and neither of us knew very much, but she knew little more than I did. And she found out that this man did come back with Ija to these good friends. They collected a suitcase full of valuables. Then he left with Ija and the suitcase. And my aunt said to me, how could anybody, we didn't know what to call it, they obviously killed her, I don't know how they killed her, but how could anybody kill a child for the sake of some goods? I would have given them everything I possessed if only he had saved her. And she suffered terribly, obviously. And on one occasion, she said to me, and I hesitate to repeat it, it's so tragic. She said, my Ija had to go into the gas chamber by herself. There was nobody to hold her hand. And it was really the most heartbreaking thing to face. And, you know, as the years go by, I sort of feel it more deeply than I did before. And of course, this is a pain my aunt lived with for the rest of her life. Although towards the end of her life, I visited her in Israel. She was in hospital. And I think on one occasion, she actually mixed me up with Ija, because when we said bye-bye, she said to me in Yiddish or German, she said, "Du bist doch mein Kind." So I don't know whether she really thought it or what she thought, but she really suffered. It's a terrible, terrible loss for her. Now, after that, I went back into the ghetto with the Working Party. And you would think that a little girl could just go through with a grown men, a column of men, but it wasn't like that, because they always checked. They checked papers and they counted, and you couldn't just get in or out of the ghetto easily. But at that time they didn't do it, but they had their agenda. But after a little while, now when I got back, I found my family intact, because my brother had a work permit, and my mother, father, and sister were hidden all in different homes, in 3 different homes during the deportation. So I had the whole family still there, but that was very unusual. Most families had gone. There's just not family intact, as mine was, but unfortunately not for long, because as soon as after a little while, when they thought everybody that intended to come back into the ghetto was back, they started rounding people up. And they took them into the synagogue. That's where they were collecting them. By then, the synagogue was very dilapidated. It was our main, beautiful, big synagogue. And they used their stables at first, and it was also bombed, but still they kept the people there, and they kept going through the ghetto day in, day out, and adding people to it. And after a few weeks, they were held there without any food or water or sanitary provisions. And after some time, they were taken out, and that was on the 20th of December 1942. They were taken out in groups of 50, and they were walked to the local forest called Rakov. They were taken at dawn, and the first group found their communal grave ready, waiting for them. And the others followed. And they were killed in the most horrific way. But it's something I don't repeat because I can't bear to repeat it. And it was a terrible thing that happened. They were killing people. They had this method of killing in the forest all over Europe around that time. And although I never repeat it, this is very well documented, and it's in many books. But if I just mention one American author whose name is Christopher Browning, and the book is called Ordinary Men, because it also discusses the background of the men and what they were doing, how they were doing it, and how and questioning how they could do it. So that's how I lost my mother and sister, along with, there were 560 people when they were taken out. And there's actually on the site, on that site, the first Jews that came back to Piotrków after the war had the remains exhumed and buried in a Jewish cemetery, according to religion. But now there is sort of headstone. There are two of them, one in Hebrew, one in Polish and English. No, actually, it's totally in English. And whenever I go back to Piotrków or other visitors go there, they usually go to visit these. I actually have a PowerPoint, but I didn't use it because it's a little bit complicated. And I've got photographs of all these things. I've been back a few times. So that's how I lost my mother and sister. There were still the three of us left, but they were still rounding people up. And incidentally, I didn't tell you that we had a community of 15,000 Jews out of 55,000 population. But at one point it reached to 28,000 because quite a lot of them near us on the border got annexed, immediately became part of Germany. And so of course it had to be made what they call Judenfrei. And most of them, well, a lot of them found their way into our ghetto. Some were officially deported into the ghetto. Now, out of the 28,000 Jews, now after all the deportations and the killings, there were 2,400 left, and the ghetto had been reduced to just 2 half streets. But not for long, because they intended, while they were getting the sort of accommodation ready for these people, it became there were 2 labor camps outside, and they were designated sort of half a group to each, it's about half and half. So when they were and during that period, that short period after the main deportation, they were still rounding people up occasionally. It wasn't a long period, but they're constantly rounding people up. On one occasion, they got my aunt, who was taken away screaming, "Who'll look after my child?" She had a 5-year-old daughter, and by that time, I was the only health court member of the family left. So I was 12 and my cousin was 5, and I looked after her. And after that, the ghetto was liquidated, and the workers were going to go to their places. Wasn't completely liquidated yet, but there were still some illegals there. I was among them, and my mother had already been taken, and my sister, but I was there with my brother and my father, and they had jobs, but I was illegal. So was my little cousin and a lot of other people who are still hiding. And so they started searching for everybody. When they got everybody out, including my cousin and me, we were going to be deported. We were waiting in outside the ghetto gates in a column, and lorries were coming and picking people out from the front, taking them away, and the column was reducing, and it was all quite horrific and scary, because deportations, I don't have time to describe a deportation, but there were always very terrible things to go through. Because if you imagine that people are scared, they don't know where they're going to be sent, probably to their deaths. Children are crying, there's pandemonium, people are being shot because they're not standing straight or obeying rules. It's quite a terrible experience. And the reason I describe it, and perhaps I don't need to describe it to you, but when I speak to schools, but then don't really have the full grasp of what it was like, however many details they read. And after my talk, on one occasion, a girl came up to me and said, "Excuse me, but what actually happens when there is a deportation?" And I thought, my goodness, there aren't the words to adequately describe the Holocaust, because when somebody is deported in this country, what happens? They arrest them, they take them to the station or to the plane, probably have a meal on before, and they put them on a plane. Well, deportations during the Holocaust were very, very different. So we were being deported, and I didn't know where to. Often we did have some knowledge, but I didn't know where they were taking us. But I looked sideways to the right, and I saw an officer standing, a German officer watching. He was obviously in charge. He was a high rank. He was a lieutenant. I don't know how I knew that. Maybe I found it out afterwards. And I don't know what gave me the idea, but I went up to him and I said that I've been separated from my father and brother. They are inside the ghetto. Can I go back to them? And he was absolutely flabbergasted that I either had the courage or the audacity to approach him. But he actually had a kind face. I still remember his face. And he was sort of surprised and slightly smiling. He called over a Jewish policeman and said, "Take her back into the ghetto." And on the way, I said, "Just a minute, I've just got to collect my cousin." And he said, "You can't because she hasn't had permission." So I said, "Well, I can't go without her. What am I to do?" So I had this dilemma of having to decide what I do. Do I stay with my cousin or do I go back? And I want to stress to you that the Holocaust was full of such dilemmas. There were almost daily all different kinds of dilemmas, but it's really heart-wrenching when you've got to decide who do you stay with, and do you go or do you stay? Anyway, I just carried on arguing with him, And in then, I don't know why or how, because maybe he got fed up with me arguing, but and he was a Jewish policeman. He suddenly said, well, quickly, just take and go through the gates quickly. And that was it. I was back there. And after that, the ghetto was liquidated, and there were just two groups of workers. One was at glass works, and one was at plywood producing, very, very large concern. But I went to the plywood place, and at the age of 12, I became a slave laborer. And well, my cousin couldn't work. She was far too young. But because we worked shifts, there were always some people in the barracks keeping an eye on her. We were there about 18 months when they decided to deport us. So we were walked to the railway station. There were cattle trucks there waiting for us. And we men separately from women. We didn't know where we were being deported to, but I can tell you now that the men were sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, and I, with the women, went to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now, when we arrived at Ravensbrück, the first thing they did was to take everything away with us that we brought, and it wasn't very much that we brought. Then we had to queue up and give our names and our details, because you know the Germans were meticulous at record keeping. Then they shaved our heads. We had to undress. They took our clothing away. We went through cold communal showers, and when we came out at the other end, we could not recognize each other. With our shaved heads, they gave us the striped jacket and skirt, and with our shaved heads, we all looked exactly the same. It's difficult to describe what it does to a person to be stripped of one's, well, your personality goes with the loss of hair and loss of and their uniform, and you're stripped of your personality, you're stripped of your identity, you just feel that you're nothing, you're nobody. It really does something to you. And one of the things it does is to make you lose hope. And without hope, there is no survival. And this showed itself very quickly because my aunt, Franja Klein, died soon after we arrived. And my best friend, Pema Blachman, died soon after that. And if you notice, these days when I talk about anyone that perished in the Holocaust, I always give their name. I could just say friend, aunt, but it's because they've become numbers, all the victims. And I feel that it is so important to keep their identity if you know it. So those were the two casualties which happened very quickly. But quite a lot of people were dying all the time. Now in Ravensbrück, some people worked and some didn't. I didn't work. Probably I was too young to work. I don't know, but I don't know the reason. And our rations were half a slice of black bread and well, a grey liquid cold soup and a brown liquid cold coffee. And occasionally we got a knob of margarine. The food was very meager. The work was very hard for those who worked. And one of the things that I remember most about Ravensbrück is the Appellplatz. I don't know if any of you know what an Appellplatz is, but it's a sort of roll call. And every hut had the space in front of it. So every morning we had to be out there by 6 o'clock to be counted. And well, this is just one of the things. I won't go into detail about Ravensbrück because soon afterwards we're only there between 2 and 3 months, about 2.5 months, when they decided to deport us. And this time, after a shorter journey, because the previous journey was 4.5 days in cattle trucks with no food or water. This time we arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Now, when we arrived there, they were very overcrowded. They didn't have room for us, so they kept us in a tent overnight. It was an enormous tent with lots of other transport, and the dozens of languages spoken, and were very crowded. But in the morning, they let us into the camp, and what we saw defies description. I'm sure that I don't know how many of you have seen the various films that were on, particularly this year, 75 years since the liberation, and there was a lot prepared for showing on television and all sorts of films. I wonder if any of you saw them. I'll just very briefly describe what is really ingrained on my eyes and my heart. So the first thing when you got into there, the first thing that hit you was the smell and the fog. And I could explain to you why these things were there, but there isn't time for that. And then there were people there, but they were like skeletons, and they were sort of shuffling along aimlessly. They'd shuffle and they'd just collapse and die. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people died just walking along. You could be speaking to someone and they'd suddenly die in front of your eyes. We were, and because of that, there were loads of dead bodies everywhere, and there were piles of bodies and piles of twisted, rotting corpses, and just naked corpses. It was just a shocking sight. We were being taken to a hut when on the way I heard that there was a children's hut somewhere in the camp, and I quickly set out to find it. And all this time I had my little cousin with me, and we found the place. There was a Dr. Bimcon, Sister Luba, who interviewed us. And if you ever go, if you ever read about Bergen-Belsen, you find their names. Anyway, after asking us a lot of questions, she turned to me and said, I'm too old. And I was by then 14. So I said, okay, I understand. Will you take my cousin? She was 7. And they said, oh, yes, we'll definitely take her, but we can't take you. But there was no way Anne was going to part from me. She was very adamant about that, because all the way through she was so terrified of losing me. Well, we got into this, and that really saved us. I have absolutely no doubt that without that we would never have survived. Although the conditions were only minutely better, we had, you know, had people looking after us, and they were kind to us, because they were the inmates who were running it. But it was very different from being in the main camp, where we definitely wouldn't have survived. And incidentally, Anne Frank was there at the same time, not in the children's home, but she was on the main camp. And well, of course, she died. She died in March, and we were liberated in April. I arrived in February. She died in March. We were liberated in April. Now, even after these minutely better conditions, I still succumbed to typhus, and I remember lying on the upper bunk by the window. I must have come back into consciousness, where I saw people running, and I didn't know, it didn't interest me why they were running or where they were running. All I could think of was, how did they have the strength to run? And that was the 15th of April, 1945, when we were liberated by the British. And this is where it stops. So that was the end of the war for me. I just want to add very briefly, it needs saying more than I'll say about it, but the British were absolutely wonderful. Our liberators were outstanding in the way they treated us. In fact, they were almost, well, many of them gave their lives because they died of typhus themselves. It was such a terrible, terrible disease and so infectious. And they had a very big job on their hands, but anyway, they were wonderful. And on that note, I finish my talk, and I think I've done it within the time. And thank you very much for listening. You may want to ask questions. I don't know.
You've done very well, and we're hugely grateful. Thank you, Mala. I'm going to ask if people just want to identify themselves on the chat, if they want to ask questions first before we have a sort of free-for-all. And whilst people do that, can I perhaps ask you, can you tell us briefly really what happened to you and to your cousin whom you looked after liberation?
What happened after?
And
yeah, well,
what
we
happened
were
after for the first.
Oh, I don't know. My eyes looked closed for a minute. I think it's the camera stopped. Okay. Oh,
Okay.
no, sorry. You were here in my place. Did you know that?
Sorry?
No. Oh, okay. No, but when you talk, you can't. Yeah. Okay. After liberation, when we recovered, we were in a children's home, a really proper children's home this time. And we were sent to Sweden. Quite a large group of children were sent to Sweden in July. So I left quite early on, and the Swedes offered to take any number of they opened their gates to the survivors. They were wonderful. I stayed with a group of children my age, but after that I was separated from Anne because, but it's very strange that she was so terrified of losing me during the war. Once the war was finished, she was a different child. She shed that fear so quickly. She was quite different, and she didn't mind being with children her own age. Because after all, she was half my age. I was 14 and she was 7. And once you start learning and going, going to school, you wouldn't, a 7-year-old wouldn't be there with a 14-year-old. So we were separated at first in the same sort of building, but then ultimately she went to, to a different building, different town, but we were corresponding. And during that time in Sweden, I found out that my brother survived. And
can you tell us how? How did you find that out? Through the Red Cross?
Well, I eventually got, there were various groups of sort of special organizations and committees that were going round the camps and the what's name camps as well, the displaced persons camps, trying to find family for people. They were going around with lists. And there was one particular group that came from England, and it was them who found out, or who took a letter back to England for me, because although I didn't know, no, it wasn't then, I didn't know my brother had survived. I thought nobody had survived. But he found out that I survived, because when the war finished, he immediately went back to Poland to see if anybody survived. And there he met somebody who had seen me in Bergen-Belsen after the war. So he knew through that. It was just a question of finding me where in Sweden I lived and where I was. And once he did establish that, I came over here to be reunited with him. So it was nearly 2 years before we were reunited after the war.
And do you remember can you tell us, was that too personal, what your first meeting with your brother was like after all that time apart? Or was that a too personal question?
Well, we were actually corresponding for all that time, from the time that we found one another to the time that we met. We were in contact all the time, and lots of letters exchanged, and so we knew exactly what, one knew what the other one was doing, and it was just a question of waiting to be reunited. So I arrived in Gravesend from, I can't remember the port in Sweden. I did know it, I can't think of it. But I arrived in Gravesend, and Ben came to meet me with his, with a friend who was from Piotrków. And we traveled to Victoria by train. I mean, it was a obviously very emotional reunion, and a very happy one, but happy mixed with some sadness, because, well, our parents and our sister hadn't survived, but we knew that by then anyway. We had known it for quite a while by then. So, but there was still some, we knew how my mother and sister died, but we didn't know about our father. But then a witness told us what happened. Well, he tried to escape from a death march, and that's how he met his death. Some other people. So, and that's how we were reunited in England.
So my final question, and then I will open up the floor and won't monopolize you, tempting as it is. When did you start to speak about your Holocaust experiences? Did you do that straight away, or did you tell your children?
No. Well, this is interesting, but it's really a whole big subject of its own, because nobody spoke about the Holocaust afterwards. A little bit, just after, among ourselves. And other people, I think they were curious, but they didn't want to ask. It just seemed too horrific for that. And there was just a tiny bit at the very beginning, after the war. but then it stopped. And sometimes I used to think that maybe people are not interested. And I couldn't understand that. But I know now, looking back, you can really tell much better. You look at what happened. And really, as it says in the Bible, there's a time for everything. And, you know, there's time to talk and there's a time to be silent. And that was not the time to talk, because when you look back, you realize that people here were also getting over the war. They also had tragedies, and they had people were coming back from the forces. They had no jobs. They're bombed out. They lost people. People had problems. It was very tough after the war. So that wasn't the time to indulge in, you know, discussing these really horrific things. I say indulge, but it wasn't a time to concentrate on something that was so sad. I suppose maybe people wanted to forget. But I remember exactly when it started and when it became popular. Never as popular as it is today, of course. But it started with a reunion in Israel. I know the year 1981, I think it was. And there were apparently a few men in one of the camps who were talking about when they're liberated. They didn't say if, but they say, actually, they may well have said if. They said if they survive this war, they're going to meet in Israel. I think there were a few of them, I think it was 6. And it came to pass because that was organized more or less on the basis of that. There may have been other reasons as well. But a very big reunion was organized in Israel with people from all over the world. And I remember in those days, 81, the Zionist Society was still very active. We belonged to a very active group. And my friends on the committee said to me, you know, when you come back, when you're there, make notes, because when you come back, we'll want you to speak about it, tell us about it. And I said, oh no, I couldn't speak to a group. No way. She said, look, just take notes anyway, just for yourself. Anyway, when I got back, they did persuade me to speak. And this wasn't a very big group. We had quite a large committee, but the membership wasn't that large. We had meetings in people's houses, and maybe 30 would be quite a good size. The lounges weren't so big in those days. People weren't extending like today. And they arranged the meeting, but they had the foresight to actually hire a place, not to do it, you know, not to do it in somebody's house. And I don't know if you remember in North Finchley, there used to be, well, they called it Balfour House then. There used to be the Zionist Federation there. And they had some accommodations, some, not big halls or anything, but it was a very big room, a small hall they hired. And surprisingly, I think, was it 70 or 100, between 70 and 100 people turned up to this meeting. So it showed that there was an interest, but they just didn't do it because they thought they couldn't bear to ask about it, or they didn't want to upset the survivors. I remember one of my friends saying to me at this meeting, she said, you know, Mala, I've known you for so long, but I've never heard your story. And I said, well, you're not going to hear it tonight because I'm going to speak about the meeting, not about myself. But obviously people ask questions and things creep in. And, you know, there were quite a lot of questions about myself. But so I remember I started talking then. But it may have been even before then, because there was the odd organization. You know, the shul would ask me to speak, or a church, or a youth club. There was one particular youth club. I can't remember now what is it, and the leader of it is now the chief executive officer of a very important, and I can't remember the name, I can't remember his name, but it's an organization that does the statistics all the time. It's always got articles in the Jewish Chronicle about the Jewish community, how it's growing or shrinking, or what's happening. He's, I just can't remember his name, but I remember he was in the forefront, because I remember, because I've seen him since. He lived sort of in around North Finchley, and I know his parents and his grandparents, but he was in the forefront of organizing meetings with survivors. People didn't do that in those days. So we organized the meeting with me speaking. But of course, it's never been as, dare I use the word, popular as it is today. It's a bit late in the day because there aren't many survivors left, but those that are, they were pretty hard. And the hard work is going to schools where we have to travel very long distances. I mean, I go as far as the top of Scotland and right to the bottom, to Devon and Cornwall, and to Wales and to Northern Ireland and all over the place. And people want to know, not only Jewish people.
Thank you very much. You're a remarkable lady, if I may say. I am now going to open the floor to questions. I think the best way is if anybody has a question, they should speak, and I'm hoping Zoom will pick them up. So if there's anyone out there for questions?
One second. Wait, no. Yeah, please take yourself off mute if you want to ask the question, and it'll focus on you.
Just put everyone on mute.
Can you hear it? No, I mean, can you see who it is?
Sorry, I think we've covered the ground extensively, and I'm going to wrap things up by saying a brief thank you and asking the rabbi to formally address you briefly. So I'll hand the floor over to Rabbi Zobin with my sincere gratitude and appreciation.
Thank you very much. First of all, Alain, thank you for handing the floor over to me, and thank you for arranging this this extraordinary evening. And thank you, Mrs. Tribich, for sharing with us your story. Hearing you speak about that with such clarity and also such depth of emotion is something that I think will stick with all of us. And I was just listening to your story, and as you were speaking, taking some notes. And it just occurred to me how you described so many different facets of the war and of the Holocaust in your story, from the loss of your community of 15,000, ghetto life, hidden with a Polish family, hidden as Christians, your return to the ghetto, the loss of your cousin Icha, and hearing you share her story, and as you said, share the stories of your family with their names, hearing how as a young child yourself you cared for your younger cousin, hearing some of your thoughts about the dilemmas that you faced and others faced. It is just an exceptional story, and as Alain said, I think all of us were listening and feeling that sense of what a remarkable person you are. You said there's a time to be silent and a time to talk, but after the war, for all of us to know that it wasn't a time to be silent, it was a time that you went on and built a family, your children, your grandchildren, built yourself up, and so many others in doing that, is also something which is, for me, hearing that story, certainly an inspiration and a lesson. So really, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you so much for sharing of your time, for sharing of yourself with not just our community and the Jewish community, but beyond. You described your travels, mentioned your travels up and down the country in sharing your story, which is so important. And for us to hear the story, it's such a privilege and such a profoundly important thing for us and our children. And my children were listening to the story as you were speaking. It's so important for all of us to hear firsthand from you what you went through and what you saw and what you experienced. And through you sharing that, bringing also some memory to those names you mentioned of those precious souls who you lost. So on behalf of all of us, we thank you and we salute you. You are an inspiration to us. Thank you so much for sharing your story and of yourself this evening.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Zobin. Mala, just to say again, to echo what Rabbi Zobin says, and I think he speaks, as he always does, on behalf of the whole community. We're hugely grateful to you, and this is an evening which none of us will ever forget. Thank you very, very much indeed. I wish you a good evening. I wish you, please God, you should, in this strange period in our lives, something which none of us have experienced, I wish you only good health and all the blessings that God should bestow on you. Thank you very much. I conclude this evening by asking Malcolm Cohen to daven Mari for us. Just again, finally, just say thank you, a huge thank you again.
Thank you.
Ja, het is in te snel. Gelijk gebroken.
Beautiful evening. Well done, Alan.